Welcome to Explosive Enterprises, and this is the APS CAM870 Mk3 shell-ejecting shotgun. We've had 7 years of experience with various APS shotguns, and felt it's time to fully review the platform and, more importantly, show you how to make it practical and effective. The Real 870 dates to 1951 when Remington introduced it as a cheaper, mass-producible replacement to their excellent but expensive Remington Model 31. Despite the push for mass production, reusing many of the parts designed for the semi-automatic 1148, the use of dual action bars and a lightweight receiver contributed to reliability and handling. So while not a revolutionary design, it achieved the rare combination of cheap and effective, and rapidly became popular among competitors, hunters, police, and militaries alike. In the decades that followed, the Remington 870 saw prominent service in police forces across the US, as a primary weapon among base and naval security units, and as a specialized breaching tool for door kickers and point men in direct combat roles. It was America's favorite shotgun, and in the 1980s, it even held the record for the most produced shotgun in history. And then the Mossberg 500 came along. The Mossberg wasn't quite as smooth, but it was simple and effective, and being designed around an aluminum receiver and cast parts allowed it to be sold for even cheaper than the 870. Remington introduced cheaper 870 variants to compete, but neither manufacturer could secure a clear advantage. And then Remington was bought by Freedom Group in 2007. While the 870 is still around today, Freedom Group's attempts to bring down manufacturing costs even further have compromised the reliability and quality that the 870 was once known for, with new guns now often demonstrating functional issues, finish problems, and unexpected breakages. Older 870s remain fantastic shotguns, but as the saying goes, they just don't make them like they used to. Spoiler alert, this is actually going to be relevant. Well, APS has manufactured 3 versions of what they call the CAM870. The gun we'll be reviewing is a Mk3 Magnum, and we'll mention differences with the older versions as we go. In particular, this model appears to be based on a 20-inch Express Magnum with a slug barrel, which is a reasonably common hunting setup, but outfitted with an aftermarket chote magazine extension. That's a bit of an odd combo, though we do have some evidence for it being a commercial configuration. Unfortunately, we don't have a real 870 in this exact configuration to compare against, but since my wife happens to collect combat shotguns, we do have a Remington 870 Police Wingmaster. So, let's start by reviewing the externals. Right off the bat, it's not hard to see the differences in finish when compared to the real shotgun. Even ignoring the different furniture and small parts, most of the APS parts are flat anodized black, a pretty typical finish for airsoft parts, while the real Remington parts have either gorgeous deep gloss bluing or greenish-gray parkerizing. If you're familiar with real shotguns, there's no mistaking the APS for one because that black anodizing is a dead giveaway that it isn't steel. Let's go through specifics. The CAM870 barrel is nominally a 20-inch, but it actually measures about a quarter-inch short. The rifle sights are faithfully replicated and adjustable for elevation and windage, but the parts are fixed to the dovetail slots by concealed screws rather than being brazed in place. The barrel is cast alloy, as are pretty much all the externals, rather than steel as on the real thing. The finish isn't particularly durable, and it shows wear and handling marks quickly. The magazine tube, extension adapter, and stabilizing bracket are, as mentioned, patterned off a chote extension kit. As you can see, they're all a little different from the Remington equivalents. Moving back, we have a wood forend in the classic Wingmaster style, and note that this is the original finish as it comes from APS. We believe this is birch, which on the real thing is used on the cheaper 870 Express line in lieu of the traditional walnut, but this raw blonde finish is atypical as usually the birch furniture is dyed darker. We did try stripping the stock to refinish it, but as you can see, even after cleaning with paint stripper, a new stain didn't take very well. The tube itself is aluminum, but the action bars are steel, and we'll be talking a lot more about those later. And the action bars pass through a pair of securing blocks, which are screwed into the receiver, in contrast to the real 870 where the tube is welded in. The receiver is again cast, with faint APS markings on the left side. On the right side, the bolt is visible. You may notice that the bolt itself is shaped a little differently, as it has this distinct flute that is not present on any factory Remington bolt. And then there are these ugly scrapes from handling, which demonstrate that the alloy and anodizing aren't a particularly tough combo. On the underside, the factory carrier is steel and has a matte black finish that's a little closer to real looking than the anodized parts. It incorporates the flexi tab cutout, something Remington introduced to police guns in the late 1980s and to all new production in the 90s, and which is missing on our reference. The flexi tab simply helps prevent a shell that releases when it shouldn't from locking up the gun. The fire control group is unremarkable, with the same black finish as the receiver. The housing is alloy, while the cross pins, action release, trigger, and crossbolt safety are all steel. And we've already mentioned the stock, but the butt features a rubber recoil pad and a rear sling swivel stud is provided. So overall, this is about what you'd expect from a mid-level airsoft replica. It has steel for small or high-stress functional components, which is a nice step up from fully cast Maruzen, or Tokyo Marui shotguns, but all the large parts are cast alloy with an unconvincing surface finish. Well, let's disassemble. First, unscrewing the butt pad exposes the bolt securing the stock, and taking that out allows the stock to come off. Pushing out 2 body pins then frees the fire control group, which wiggles out at an angle, and tends to pop the shell latch retaining plate out in the process. The shell latches now slide out, although they are a bit tricky to remove. And with the bolt back, a stop plate can be removed from the top of the receiver. That's it for the receiver, so now we move to the front. Loosening the mag tube clamp allows it to slide off, and then the magazine tube extension and adapter can unscrew. Once the adapter is off, we can remove the magazine spring and follower, and then the barrel can slide forwards and off. Now at this point, the next step on a stock gun would be to remove the screws securing the magazine tube, but we've modified this gun so that that is not necessary, and instead we'll just slide the action out the front as one does on a Real 870. And that's the gun apart, so now let's walk through individual parts. First, the barrel. Like an actual smoothbore shotgun barrel, this is just a smooth tube of appropriate diameter. However, where a real shotgun has a forcing cone, which is a gradual taper from the diameter of the shell to the actual bore diameter, the APS just has a hard shelf. That isn't actually a problem, since the APS shells don't have a crimp to worry about, so this simply ensures an ideal gas seal when firing. Also, unlike a Real 870 barrel, this doesn't feature a locking notch, which isn't necessary for an airsoft gun, but has some fun implications we'll get to later. Moving down to the tube extension, this simply contains a recoil spring with a threaded plug. This extension provides a 7 shell capacity, same as its real counterpart. The clamp is a simple design that stabilizes the tube and provides a mounting point for a sling. Not much to say here. But before reassembling, I'm going to replace both of these with a homemade Remington style extension and factory Remington clamp to better match the reference gun. The extension adapter collar has a series of divots on the back, and these align to a spring-loaded ball bearing on the barrel for retention so it doesn't rely on friction to hold in place. As mentioned before, this collar is styled off a choke extension rather than a Remington one, and the threading is very different, so a real extension will not fit. Now the forend, and I'm going to disassemble this further. APS sells a forend removal tool, or a real one will fit with a bit of scraping on the wood, but a pair of screwdrivers and significant patience will also suffice to get the retention collar off. The action bars are, as mentioned, steel, which is important as pretty much all the gas shotguns with alloy bars have needed steel replacements sooner or later. These are a pretty simple construction that hold the bolt and interact with the shell stops, and are welded to the forend tube. Note that a real forend will fit, so I'm going to go ahead and replace the Wingmaster forend with a police one. However, it does need some small spacers for the action bars to prevent it from being able to twist, though we have noticed that some forends are drop-in. Also, with a real forend removal tool will now fit cleanly, and that makes reinstalling the retention collar much easier. The tube and receiver are unremarkable, though if we look inside the receiver, we can see the ejector, which is a piece of spring steel riveted in place. I also previously removed the bolt stop, which limits the travel of the bolt rather than allowing it to slam a plastic hull into that squared-off forcing cone. And as mentioned before, we filed down the top of the securing blocks which hold the tube to the receiver so that the bolt can be removed without having to tediously unscrew these 4 screws and risk compromising alignment. More on that later. On a Real 870, the shell latches are staked to the receiver and not intended to be ever serviced, but on the APS they're removable. This is good, because while the shell latches are steel, unfortunately they're a pretty soft steel and so are prone to fatigue over time. Removing them allows for periodic readjustment, which we'll cover later. Note that the proper alignment to the shell latches is ensured by this end plate that is retained by the stock, but also because the shell latches are so long and protrude into the stock area, a real stock will have to be inletted to fit. To be clear, the way the shell latches actually work is that the action bars have sloped cuts on them that engage with the latches to bend them out of the way. When the action bars are fully forwards, the right side latch is pushed out, and when the action bars are fully back, the left side latch is pushed out. This is a simple system that controls the release of shells, and we'll be covering how that works in practice once we have the gun fully reassembled. The bolt isn't too far off from its real counterpart. It has a screw-on plate at the bottom that interfaces with the action bars and fire control group, and a spring-loaded firing pin with a guide collar to prevent out-of-battery contact with the shell. It also has a hardened steel ball bearing at the base, which stops the travel of the hammer when firing and prevents it from beating up the firing pin. The extractor is spring-loaded, although a different design from the real thing, and the bolt of course has no locking block. Oh, and the bolt is predominantly alloy. The trigger group, on the other hand, is quite similar to that of a real 870. Everything except the housing itself is steel, and how it works will be very familiar to anyone who has worked on an actual 870. The action release at the front has a spring that lifts it into position behind the bolt, locking the action closed unless the release is pushed. Pulling the trigger pulls on the main sear to drop the hammer, which when it fully travels forwards allows the hammer spring to force the action release, which both unlocks the action and lifts the transfer bar from the trigger to disconnect from the main sear. When the trigger is released, it resets, and pulling the trigger will not act on the main sear until the action release lifts into position again. This is a simple, safe, and reliable trigger system, and it's good that APS didn't mess with it, though note that everything is just a little off dimensionally from its real counterparts, so it may be difficult to drop in real parts, but that really isn't necessary. Oh, and as for the carrier, that's also the same as a real one, but it's worth discussing further. I want to note that this piece, termed a dogleg, is actually from a real 870, and it behaves a little differently from the APS one, so to avoid confusion, I'm going to swap the carrier now for a cosmetically modified but functionally stock APS one. Regardless, the way this functions is simple, albeit a bit unintuitive. First, the geometry of the dogleg allows the carrier to toggle between two positions. However, when the bolt is in the way, the carrier can't go high enough to lock upwards, so it'll still return when pushed up for loading. As the bolt comes back, it simply pushes the dogleg out of the way, but when the bolt is brought forwards again, a small notch on the underside of the bolt engages with this hook on the dogleg, pushing it forwards and downwards. This cams the carrier up, locking it in the raised position until the bolt clears the dogleg and then pushes the carrier back down again. While the APS parts are steel, the geometries of the parts involved here are extremely important and, well, let's just say we'll be coming back to this. The entire trigger group is held to the receiver via steel cross pins as mentioned, which lock to the trigger group via the spring tabs that retain the axles. Note that these pins are both the same size, unlike on a real 870 which uses two different sizes, and real pins will not fit. And then lastly, the screw that secures the stock is an ordinary M6x1 metric bolt. I'm going to replace the stock with a G&P replica of the police overfolder. So the good news internally is that once again this is heavily based on the real thing and steel where it counts, though we do have to stress that not all steel is created equal and there are parts that may need maintenance. Having said that, there's a pervasive meme around these guns that we want to address. APS's initial Mark I design was pulled off the market in 2016 due to allegedly being convertible to fire actual live shotgun ammunition. Let's walk through all the reasons this is bogus. First, the barrel is pot metal, so even if you were to bore it out to fit an actual 12 gauge, it has a snowball's chance in hell of surviving the nearly 12,000 psi peak pressure. Second, neither the bolt nor barrel have any locking mechanism, so the only thing keeping the bolt forwards against nearly 8,000 pounds of momentary bolt thrust would be the thin action release. And third, even if the firing pin were substantially modified to set off a primer, the gun lacks a solid bolt face to prevent a primer blowout and is made of soft aluminum that would not resist deformation. There are more reasons, but the bottom line is that making a CAM870 fire live ammunition would require replacing all the pressure-bearing parts with real equivalents, most of which would still require substantial alteration to fit, and at that point it's not a CAM870, it's a real shotgun with a few airsoft bits. And sure enough, according to a translated statement, it seems that criminals in Taiwan were not in fact using live ammo, but rather improvising half-assed firecrackers out of APS shells. The Mark III is just a dimensionally altered Mark I that ostensibly is less compatible with real parts, but none of the fundamentals changed, so we get the distinct sense that this redesign was really just a dog and pony show to make it seem like something had been done. Was I going somewhere with this? Alright, so the point of all this is just to highlight that while the CAM870 might feed and eject things that look like shotgun shells and does have a very realistic internal mechanism made with steel in many areas, it's still just a toy. Reassembly is straightforward, but we recommend approaching the receiver last and in a particular order. First, reinstall the shell latches and hold them in place while inserting the retaining plate. This will keep them in position and makes the rest of assembly much easier. Next, insert the fire control group at an angle, careful not to bump the retaining plate, and slide it into position. Install the cross pins, pulling the shell latches as needed. And then lastly, install the stock. I've mentioned the shells a couple of times, so let's look at those now. Each shell has two primary assemblies, a plastic hull and a machined aluminum body that it threads onto. The idea is simple. You fill the base with CO2, then load the hull with whatever you want to shoot, be it BBs, a paintball, other items, and you're ready to shoot. While early CAM870 shells required a separate filling tool, current or smart shells have an integral fill valve and fill in the same manner as CO2 grenades, using an adapter on a CO2 bottle. The shell body comes apart by unscrewing the base, and internally we can see that this is a very simple push valve with internal spacers, sealed with an O-ring at either end. These shells are excellently made, being turned from aluminum stock and using polyurethane O-rings for maximum durability with CO2. As far as size, they're very similar to 12-gauge shells, but the length is a little closer to the older 2 5/8 shells rather than more common 2 3/4 inch shells, and the rim is shaped a little differently. We'll talk more about filling and loading shells later. For now, let's get back to the gun and go over controls and operation. First things first, shells load just like you'd expect. Depress the carrier, insert a shell into the magazine tube, and make sure the shell gets far enough to clear the left side latch or it'll kick it back out. If you need to unload the tube, you can push the latch in to manually release a shell. Once the tube is loaded, depress the action release to unlock the action, and cycle the pump to load the first shell. The crossbolt safety is easy to engage and disengage, right for safe, left for fire. The trigger is a simple single action with a very light take-up before a mushy but serviceable break. Pull the trigger to fire, enjoy the big plume of CO2 and whatever you had loaded in it going downrange, and pump again to cycle. I should note that if there is rearward pressure on the forend when the hammer falls, it won't actually unlock the action until that tension is released. This is accurate to the real thing, as this is actually an inertial safety mechanism intended to keep the action locked in the event of a hangfire. On a shotgun that doesn't have this feature, such as this Winchester 1200, pulling on the forend and then pulling the trigger causes it to cycle instantly. Now on a real 870, most shooters will never notice this feature because even if you're pulling on the pump, the instantaneous recoil from firing will slacken the tension and allow it to unlock. But on a functionally recoilless airsoft gun, it's possible to outrun the action and yank on the pump before it unlocks. So you need to learn the cadence. Shoot, pull, push, repeat. Simple, right? Just speed it up and you're good to go.
Were it so easy.
Well, this is actually my second CAM870, having owned and sold a Mark I years ago, and when this brand new gun failed hard on its first outing, I knew something was up. So before we get into performance, let's backtrack and run through the major reasons why these guns have problems and how to fix them. Alright, so first things first, the real 870 is a slick, easy to cycle shotgun, but the stock CAM870 is nowhere close, and the excessive force needed to pump it can cause other problems. There are two major reasons for this issue: alignment of the tube and alignment of the action bars. First, part of why the tube is welded onto the receiver on a real 870 is to ensure it perfectly aligns with the receiver as it should. On the CAM870, varying the amount of tension applied to the four securing screws can change the alignment of the tube and cause the pump tube to drag against it. We recommend thread locking all four screws and check alignment relative to the receiver to get it as close to parallel as possible. However, even with the tube aligned properly, it's still common for the pump to drag, as evidenced by this surface wear. The reason is because APS welds the action bars on, but not very precisely. We had to carefully bend the action arms so they would line up with the holes on the receiver, as the natural flexibility of the steel will allow them to fit with imperfect alignment but causes drag. Additionally, we polished the action parts and bolt and used a thin oil to thoroughly lubricate the interior of the action. Normally we recommend grease for lubricating, as we covered in our gas blowback maintenance video, and we do stand by that recommendation for gas blowback guns. Here, having a slick surface is most important. There's no blowback, so we don't need to worry about gas pushing oil around. There's no hop for oil to get into and compromise anyways. I'm not going to put hundreds of shots through it in one day, and frankly, field stripping the 870 is sufficiently annoying that I'd rather just periodically drip oil into the moving parts than have to take the whole thing apart again. Now the action is much smoother, but there are other problems. Let's start with releasing shells from the tube. The action relies on the two shell latches working in concert, and if either is out of spec, it will result in shells not releasing or releasing when they shouldn't. First, if you push in a shell, the gun just spits it back out. The left side shell latch, that's the right side when looking at it from below, isn't retaining the shell. We suggest bending the latch to apply more tension, and if that doesn't solve it, bend the actual tooth that protrudes into the tube. The important thing is just not to bend it too far, or it won't release shells when it needs to. Next, if the gun releases 2 shells at once when feeding, jamming the action, the problem is the right side shell latch. The fix is the same, it just needs enough tension to spring out and interrupt the next shell after the first one releases. If the gun won't feed shells at all, chances are one of the latches is protruding too far into the tube and won't let the shells pass, but if it just won't feed shells on a fully loaded tube, the problem is the rough surface on the end of the latches having too much friction against the shells. We recommend polishing the end of each latch to prevent this. Alright, so now it releases shells as it should.
Give me a
Shell.
silly. One
Shell.
only, please. Aye, Captain.
And now we get to the dubiously fun part, feed and ejection reliability. Right off the bat, these guns need some extractor alteration for reliable function because CAM870 shells have more pronounced rims than real shells. Filing the inside lower corner at an angle makes it easier for the shells to slide up onto the bolt face, while extending the angle on the front of the extractor helps shells get in front of the claw to pop past instead of getting stuck. Simple enough so far. Next, if the shell ejection is weak or inconsistent in direction, or just drops the shell into the action, both the extractor and ejector may need reshaping. First, for the ejector, we insert a hex key or other hook-shaped tool under the ejector hump, place a punch or screwdriver in front of the hump, and tap the punch with a hammer to flatten the ejector slightly. This helps ensure that the shell only contacts the hump of the ejector, and only at the end of travel. But it's still only ejecting properly if the action is run quickly, so we need to tweak the extractor too. We found that the back of it protruded enough to contact the receiver, so as the bolt passed the ejection port, it would force the back of the extractor in, causing it to release the shell prematurely. Filing down the back of the extractor allows it to clear the receiver, and now it holds onto the shell all the way until the ejector pushes it off. There's one last tweak to make, and it's a big one. The carrier. On a stock gun, if the action is run slowly, the carrier will likely fail to lift high enough to feed a shell. Or if it's run quickly, it may misfeed a shell, either allowing the rim to pop out or catching the hull on the front of the ejection port. All of these have the same root cause, which is the dogleg on the carrier failing to drive the carrier as high as it should. As I mentioned before, the cutout on the underside of the carrier catches on the hook of the dogleg and drives it downwards. However, on the stock APS parts, it only does this for a short distance before the hook slips out from under the carrier. When the action is run vigorously, it has enough momentum to lift high enough to feed, but not always all the way. The fix is simple. We take material off the top of the curve behind the hook, flattening it out. This allows the dogleg to travel lower, forcing the carrier to lift higher before the hook slips off the carrier. Note that it may be necessary to round off the back of the bolt to prevent the modified hook from getting stuck on it, but that's it. Now whether the action is cycled slowly or vigorously, the carrier slams up to pin the shell against the top of the receiver until the bolt can grab it and push it home. All this goes to show that it is not enough to have a good design and to make it from the right materials, it also needs precise tolerancing and quality control. Pump-action shotguns are a lot more mechanically sophisticated than people tend to believe, and slight imperfections in geometry can have substantial effects on reliability. This is, amusingly, a surprisingly accurate replica of the post-Freedom Group acquisition Remington shotguns, demonstrating many of the same problems that new owners have run into on the corner-cutting new production 870s. Well, with the problem solved, now it works as it should, and it'll belt out shells as quickly as I can work the pump. It's neither as smooth nor as angrily metallic as the real Wingmaster, but it's certainly more intimidating than your average Springer. Alright, now to actually talk performance, we first have to dive into loading shells. APS currently manufactures both the standard Smart shells and X-Power shells. They both use the same plastic hulls, but the X-Power shells hold a little more gas at the cost of less room for BBs. APS's intended loading method for Smart shells is for you to use their long CO2 adapter to fill it, then insert a plastic wad, fill it with 12 BBs, and cap it with an APS overshot card. The process is the same for X-Power shells, but they require a shorter wad that only holds 8 BBs. This system works,
but it can be better.
First off, the plastic wads have a lot of drag in the barrel, but they also don't seal perfectly, so ballistically they don't get as much power out of the shells they theoretically could. Second, because the wads don't open up immediately after firing, a close-range shot will typically hit as a multi-joule hard plastic slug, which is not particularly sporting. Third, while the wads can theoretically be reused, getting them back is a challenge, and while BBs come in biodegradable flavors, the wads do not. And fourth, maybe most significantly, they're an additional consumable with a non-negligible cost. Over the years, I've iterated on solutions of my own, but now, with the collaboration of the rest of the XE team, I think we finally have a quick and reliable system. So we start with 140-pound watercolor paper. This is readily available on the internet or from art supply stores, or cereal boxes make for a decent substitute. We'll now use a 3/4 inch or 19mm hole punch and use this to cut the paper into circles. No need to cut up the whole pad right now, we'll just move on once we have a decent supply. We also need a loading tool. In the past, I've recommended a cartridge casing, small piece of pipe, or similar, but now we have a 3D printable loading tool on our Thingiverse page, or if you don't have access to a printer, we have it for sale on Shapeways as well. I grab a few shells and first unscrew the hulls, because we load the hulls separately from the reservoirs. I take one of the discs I just cut, insert it into the loading tool, press it onto the front of a shell, and twist while pulling to remove it. You can see that the card has been seated evenly, just past the notch at the front of the shell that's meant to retain it. I'll repeat this with the other shells. Next I flip them over, so the capped front is against my work surface, and it's time to load BBs. I'll use a speed loader full of .2s for this demonstration, and for standard smart shells I can load 17 BBs, while for X powers I can only load 11. If the top layer doesn't form an even star pattern of 5, a bit of jostling encourages them into place. So now I take another card and cap the rear of the shell, then flip the tool over and push all the way down. This tool is sized to automatically seat the card to the right depth for X powers, though for the standard smart shells it's necessary to do this against a hard surface to avoid pushing the top card out the front. Once that undershot card is crimped in place, the hull is loaded. You can see that on the front, the overshot card has inverted in the middle slightly and has been pushed into the retaining groove, and this entire shot assembly is tight and has minimal rattle. With a bit of practice, this whole process takes under 30 seconds per hull. Now we just need to fill the reservoirs. We use standard CO2 fill adapters for this, as we find APS's adapter doesn't seal very well, and with the shell disassembled anyways, there's no need for the longer stem. And we also prefer to use paintball tanks rather than the 12-gram adapter that APS sells, as the low capacity of 12-gram cartridges means the power starts to taper off pretty quickly. In any case, we now have a choice to make. If I place a shell upright on the work surface and fill with the bottle above it, as I would when filling a magazine with propane, I will be filling the shell with liquid CO2. This will maximize power, particularly in a longer barrel, but also consumes more CO2 from the bottle and may produce too much power for field limits. With the tank upright and the shell pressed into it instead, it fills with gaseous CO2, which will deliver weaker performance but consume much less CO2 from the bottle. Once the shells are filled, we can now screw on the hulls. We want to caveat that while a 17 BB load will fit on an X-Power shell, it will not leave sufficient room for the valve stem to travel. This will negatively impact performance and may cause misfires, so stick to 11 for the X-Powers. Anyways, time to shoot. So let's do a quick demonstration of each combo. First, our regular smart shell with 17.2s on gaseous CO2. Next, our smart shell with 17.2s on liquid CO2. On to the X-Power shell with 11.2s on gaseous CO2. And lastly, our X-Power shell with 11.2s on liquid CO2. As you might imagine, these are difficult to chrono, but the gaseous CO2 loads do come in under 1 joule. These guns do tend to joule creep, which is to say that heavier BBs end up with more energy than lighter ones. 12s make for low power and funny trajectories indoors, while .25s up to .3s extend the effective range without dropping so much as to be unusable. Barrel length also has some impact, with shorter barrels producing less power and wider spread, but we've noticed that with the Mark III this effect is much less significant than it was on the Mark Is. After much experimentation, we've come to the conclusion that the X-Power shells really are the way to go with these guns. Where regular smart shells need to be used with liquid CO2 to develop enough power to be useful, maybe too much power, the X-Powers can be used with gaseous CO2 for indoors short-ranged use or liquid CO2 to maximize range, making them more flexible. And the reduced BB count doesn't affect the spread, but it still produces a dense enough pattern for reliable hits while minimizing overkill. So here are some recommendations for shot loads. For point-blank room clearing without worrying about hurting anyone, we suggest 11 0.12 gram BBs on gaseous CO2. .12s are lightweight and generally poorly made, and this gives them unpredictable trajectories that help to maximize the spread. For general CQB use, try 11 0.2s on gaseous CO2. Flexible, efficient, effective. And for outdoor use, where range is a concern, try 11 0.25s or 0.28s on liquid CO2. This gives a pretty usable spread out to about 150 feet. But we haven't talked about how to actually use the gun, so now let's get into practicality. First things first, the use of aluminum in this replica makes it noticeably lighter than the real thing. Obviously, we can't give specifics for every possible configuration, but where the real Police 870 weighs 8 1/3 pounds, the APS replica weighs 6.5. That lighter weight makes it easier to manipulate one-handed, which is important for a shotgun. Because although reloading individual shells is slow, much like a real shotgun, the APS can be topped off while remaining at the ready. In practice, I've found that this makes up for the inherently low capacity, because I rarely need more than one shot to do the job, and can then immediately reload. If you want to be really cool, you can practice your load 2 technique. I'm not much good at it. And personally, I tend to feel the techniques that take the gun out of action to load as quickly as possible are great for competition, but for pretend combat they squander one of the few advantages of a 2-loaded system. The way I typically reload is thus a little more old school. I load individual shells from a pouch until the tube is full, and when the next round won't fit, I keep it in my offhand ready to go. At any point in this process, if a target presents itself, I'm ready to fire, cycle, and keep reloading. With this approach, having shells on the gun speeds up the process, and there are a couple of options there. On this top folder, I've screwed on a shot shell holder to match the reference gun, and this gets me 6 shells ready to go. Otherwise, a side saddle is a good option for carrying shells, or better yet, Velcro shell cards can be attached to your gear and then swapped onto the gun as needed. Note that CAM870 shells are not quite the same as their real counterparts, so a carrier may need sanding or shimming depending on how it's toleranced, but it will work. The same goes for pouches, and there's a dizzying variety of pouches available in multiple form factors, so try some out and see what works for you. The only style we emphatically do not recommend is the combination sling with shell loops. These are awful to reload from. Another point of consideration is gloves, because you need to stick your thumb into the action in order to load shells, and baggier gloves can get pinched or caught. Back in the day, it was common to cut the thumb and forefinger off to help manipulate shells, but nowadays there are form-fitting gloves like PIG FTTs that are more suitable for operating shotguns without compromising finger protection. Let's move on to configuration. The first decision point is the barrel. A longer barrel slightly increases power and tightens the spread, while shorter is obviously easier to handle and maneuver. Common setups in real steel include 20-inch or 18-inch for combat shotguns, 14-inch for entry guns, or 12.5 inches for maximum compactness. Longer barrels allow longer tube extensions, but note that the capacity of the CAM870 does not perfectly align to that of the real gun. The +3 extension that this gun came with achieves a 7 shell capacity. It's realistic. But so does our replicated +2 extension. And with a shorter magazine spring, the base tube can actually hold 5 shells rather than 4. We've also noticed that APS barrels often don't quite match their stated length, but if you're picky, you can always buy a longer one, cut with a hacksaw, clean up with a file and paint, and drill a hole for a new bead sight if you wish. Speaking of which, the standard sighting for shotguns is a bead sight, which isn't intended to be used for aiming per se, but rather provides an easily visible reference for point shooting. One advantage of the rifle-sighted barrel here is that it can be adjusted for elevation, and that makes it easier to compensate for drop by sighting to a known distance. On modern combat shotguns, it's fairly common to mount a red dot, but with the relatively short ranges at which the CAM870 is effective and the need for holdover at distance, your experience may vary as to how useful this is. I find for CQB, I tend to prefer a simple bead. Next up is the furniture, and this is what really shapes how the gun will be carried and used. Because the guns are compatible with real steel furniture with minor modification, there are a ton of options, but I would broadly divide them into 3 categories: fixed stock, folding stock, and no stock. The distinction is relevant because despite the lack of recoil on an airsoft platform, there are still benefits to having a full stock. 2 additional points of contact makes it much easier to hold the gun steady while cycling or reloading, a cheek weld helps with instinctive shooting, and rolling the gun sideways allows the forearm to support the weight while short stocking, freeing up the offhand to manipulate doors, drag teammates, ready a grenade, or whatever. Unless maximum compactness is needed, a stock is nice to have, and folding stocks get the best of both worlds, at the cost of typically being heavier and less comfortable than a simple fixed stock. Though at least without recoil to deal with, shooting with the police overfolder isn't like getting whacked in the face with a lawnmower blade. If you need to go maximally compact though, a pistol grip or bird's head grip is much more practical here than it is on a real 870, and I'm actually quite partial to the tiny FBI witness protection setup, particularly since, as mentioned, this replica achieves a 5+1 capacity rather than the real 4+1. Though if you carry one, it seems you're required to make a face like you just realized you left the stove on. Sorry, I don't make the rules. Anyways, the remaining major point is the one that airsofters always focus on, and not without good reason, managing shell ejection. In CQB, we find that it isn't a big deal, so we just pick them up when dead or at the end of the round. Outdoors, though, a shell catcher is needed. APS makes one, and while it does a good job of catching shells, it's kind of a pain to install and remove, particularly if you need to clear a malfunction in a hurry. A much better design is the PPS shell catcher, which requires only minor modification to fit on the APS guns using scope mount pins. We also modified it slightly by clamping on a bent piece of sheet steel, yes, we're going to paint it, which provides a bit of structure to the top of the catch bag and prevents the weight of shells from pulling it shut, allowing it to hold between 15 and 20 shells before it starts to clog up. The big advantage of this catcher is that it can pivot, which allows opening the action to clear it jammed, dump out the shells without needing to fiddle with the zipper, or to eject freely in a static position where the shells won't get lost. The only issue is that the PPS shell catcher is out of stock, and we're not sure if it'll be coming back. Still, even if used exclusively in CQB, this is a legitimately effective scattergun, and I take issue with the CAM870 being characterized as impractical. Impractical is how I would describe systems that offer no functional benefits for their drawbacks, like shell-ejecting sniper rifles or single BB shotguns. A gun that forces you to deal with shells but offers a room-clearing cone of death in return is specialized, and while it may not have a place at every field, there are niches where it can be put to good use. In contrast, the CAM870 Mk3, which holds CO2 in the bolt, suffers from such anemic power and need for constant refilling that despite using cheaper and easier to load shells, we don't feel it's worth bothering with. Speaking of cost, before we get into whether the Mk3 is worth it, I want to highlight that the APS parts ecosystem is weird. Because most of the functional parts are not compatible with their real steel equivalents, you're locked into buying bits through APS, and the selection is more limited than you might expect. For example, APS provides a couple of barrel lengths sold separately, but not the basic 18-inch with raised bead sight sold on their classic model, nor the 20-inch rifle sight of the Magnum. APS does sell the Remington style tube extension that we recreated, but only as part of the Marine model and only in silver. Want a replacement carrier? APS makes titanium nitride but not silver, hence why this gun's carrier looks odd as we had to painstakingly remove titanium nitride where it's exposed. And yet they do sell the furniture for the witness protection separately, and parts for competition builds. There doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to what's available, so we strongly recommend starting with a model close to what you want to end up with. Well, let's review pros and cons as usual. The guns have steel where it counts internally, but the quality of manufacture is not spectacular, and the externals are mostly pot metal. The guns also have significant cycling issues out of the box, and take a fair bit of work to tweak and fix. Once sorted, though, it offers a pretty entertaining shooting experience. It's also a lot more effective than people give it credit for, and the ability to tune the shot loads for different environments is pretty cool. The fact that it works like a real shotgun also means it has massive flexibility in furniture and barrel lengths, but APS's part selection is a bit limited. So overall, the build quality isn't spectacular, but it can be made reliable, and the performance is solid but takes practice and investment to make it practical. And that brings us to price. Well, the gun might be around $300, but that's only the start of it. You'll need shells, which are most economical in 25 packs for typically $180 to $200. You'll need CO2 and paper for the shot cards, an additional expense. If you want to have the gun and, say, 50 shells, with shipping you're probably looking at around $750. However, there is a way to bring that cost down. APS sells 4 packs of just the hulls for about $8, about a quarter the cost of full shells, and while hulls are tedious and time-consuming to load, the reservoir portion is quick and easy to fill. So we recommend buying at least one spare hull for each shell, and preload all the hulls the night before a game while watching TV or whatever. Between rounds of the field, just unscrew the spent hull, regas the shell, and screw on a preloaded hull. Still, even with this trick, we're talking in excess of $500 to get started, and while that's not dissimilar to the cost of a gas rifle plus mags, this is a much more niche item. More importantly, it's a significant investment for a gun that will require significant tuning out of the box. So who is the target audience for the CAM870? It's people that really want an effective airsoft Remington 870, but more realistic than the gas Tokyo Marui rendition. The TM is a great gun and easier to just pick up and play, especially outdoors, but even the 6BB mode has neither the sheer BB output of the CAM870 nor the visceral feel of cycling shells. Even if you're not sold on the idea of a shell ejector as a primary, a breacher setup on a sling with just a dozen or so shells is a cheaper way to clear rooms and get a feel for the system. That said, you really need to be ready and willing to work on your guns to make this viable, as the quality of manufacture is no better than APS's other products. Really, the best thing these guns have going for them are the shells, and you don't need a CAM870 to shoot them. The Orange Wargame Striker is a nearly full steel gun that will shoot them with no modification and retains the empties, and we've done a review on this channel previously. A Hwasan double barrel can also be converted to use APS shells with a bit of modification, or a determined tinkerer can do all sorts of silly things like a 12-gauge flare gun, converted Phoenix coach gun, or, my favorite, a Martini Henry rifle. But if you specifically want to put those shells to a pump-action shotgun, the CAM870 offers an experience that nothing else currently on the market does. Just know that you're going to pay a lot of money, you're going to spend a fair amount of time loading shells, and you're going to suffer with its mechanical flaws until you put in the time and effort to sort it out. Frankly, if you aren't both a die-hard pump shotgun enthusiast and a tinkerer, we can't recommend this gun. But if you are, then there's something here to work with. If you made it through this whole video, we appreciate you. And as always, thank you for watching.